Final Fantasy II on the SNES is the game that got me into RPGs. I'd played Dragon Warrior on the NES years before this, and it just didn't interest me. It was slow, and it was real text-based, and it just wasn't a whole lot of fun. I didn't play Final Fantasy II until years after it was released because I wasn't interested in RPGs. Around the time Final Fantasy III came out was the time that I played Final Fantasy II. I was already a fan of fantasy medieval type video games, especially games like Legend of Zelda and Crystallis. They were both amazing games, and I always loved, the whole sword and sorcery and dragons and type of stuff. It was great. When I first played Final Fantasy II, it blew my mind. The story was deeper than anything I'd ever seen before on a video game. And it was the first game where there was real drama between characters. It was pretty cool. For the purpose of this video, we're playing Final Fantasy II. Not Final Fantasy IV. Not Final Fantasy IV. Not Final Fantasy IV. Well, unless I'm specifically talking about the version of it being Final Fantasy IV. I'm really not that much of a stickler on the naming conventions. I mean, I usually, in common conversation, I'll refer to this as Final Fantasy IV, but just to avoid confusion, I guess. This is Final Fantasy II because that's what's on the cart. So, there it is. The first thing I want to talk about is the story. As I mentioned before, the story from Final Fantasy II blew me away at the time. I had never played a game that was so dramatic before I played this game. There is love, betrayal, redemption, sacrifice, and so many other themes you wouldn't expect out of a video game in 1991. This was a real story to me. All the other games I played had only a few bits of dialogue, or the entirety of their story was contained in the instruction manual or the prologue that was shown before the game started. At the time, this was huge. I haven't played through this version of the game in years. I have played through Final Fantasy IV on the Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo DS many times. I end up playing a version of this game at least once per year. I'll be honest, the translation of later ports are much better. I still enjoyed the story, and it was real interesting to see the differences in how things were translated. The story isn't any different other than some things that were added in the DS version. But you can tell the translators had to work around some space issues due to some of the weird shortcuts they take with the dialogue. This isn't bad by any means, the story is still easy to follow and you know what everyone is trying to say. It's just not as polished as the later releases were. I remember noticing that this game wasn't as pretty as some other SNES games I'd played, such as Zelda. It didn't deter me though, and that's not to say the graphics in Final Fantasy II are bad, because they aren't. The graphics are early SNES graphics. Square hadn't yet become the graphical powerhouse they were known to be by the time later Final Fantasy games came around. It's interesting to compare the graphics from Final Fantasy II to the NES Final Fantasy titles. You can see the natural progression of 8-bit into 16-bit, especially in the overhead view character sprites. Some of these sprites look like straight 16-bit recolorations of sprites in the NES games, like the wizards and some of the soldiers. The battle sequences are where the graphics really shine. The spell and summon animations are really colorful and fun. I always loved seeing what new spells that I acquired looked like. The character sprites are much more detailed and you get a better sense of what everyone is supposed to look like. The battle backgrounds are completely different for each area you visit, unlike in the NES games where you battle over a field of black with just a bit of a backdrop up at the top. Since Final Fantasy II was my first Final Fantasy game, I didn't realize how much Squaresoft had improved battles from the NES days. Compared to the NES games, battles are much faster paced and more exciting. The battles in the NES Final Fantasy games were slow-paced and kind of a chore to slog through. One contributing factor to this was the advent of the active time battle system. The story goes that Final Fantasy's planner, Hiroki Ito, was watching a Formula One race when he came up with the new approach to the battle system. He saw cars pass each other and thought it would be interesting if characters each had different speeds. When I first started playing Final Fantasy II for this review, the random encounters weren't that bothersome. The further I got into the game, random encounters got more frequent and more annoying. I'm not sure if this was just bad luck, but I do remember several times, well, more than several times, where I would leave a battle only to run into another battle after just a step or two. In a few dungeons, I started to run more and more often, just because I felt like I wasn't making any progress. I don't really understand why the developers decided to add a punishment for running. Why do I have to lose cash for every run? I guess they were trying to detract you from running so you didn't get behind in character levels. The worst part about frequent random encounters is the fact that if you don't know exactly where everything is in a dungeon, you may find yourself wandering around screen to collect all of the treasures. If you go the way you were supposed to go, then backtrack to find a treasure, you're going to have to slog through several fights. It's just kind of annoying. The nice thing about Final Fantasy II is that it isn't really a grind fest. If you fight most of your battles throughout the game, you can make it to the end without ever having to grind for levels. I only found myself stopping at one point to level up, and that was right before I took on a certain summon boss. Rydia hadn't learned Lit 3 yet, and I really wanted it for that particular fight. I didn't have to grind for long though, so that's a bonus. Menus are easy enough to manage. I really would have liked to seen the ability to use the L and R buttons to switch between character-specific menus. That wasn't included until later Final Fantasy games, I guess. Also, I didn't like how items are used. When you use an item, you have to open up a menu showing all of your characters, then you select the character that you want to use the item on, and after that, the character menu closes, and you only get to use one item. You have to open that menu every single time you want to use an item. So if you want to use several potions in a row, well, you're going to close that menu out and open it back up several times in a row. It's just a bit tiresome. Final Fantasy II is fairly easy. As most of you know, the Japanese version is much harder. In the US version, you don't have all of your attack items like silver hourglasses and such. You only have one heal item that heals all negative status conditions, and it's fairly cheap. A lot of characters are missing special abilities, and enemies are not nearly as tough. If you're looking for a challenge, try one of the other versions of this game first. The DS version is probably the hardest in my opinion. One of the biggest high points is the music. The music added so much dramatic emphasis to the story in this game. You knew when the characters were feeling sad or triumphant based on the music. The overworld theme invokes a sense of exploration, while the dungeon theme may invoke a sense of mystery, foreboding, or even danger. Final Fantasy II has some of the most fantastic music and most memorable music on the SNES or on really any system to this day. I actually had to replace the battery in this cartridge. I'd never done it before. It was the first time I'd ever performed surgery on an NES or SNES cartridge. Got the soldering iron out and put the battery on there, and I was successful, and it started working. I had originally played through to the Paladin portion of the game, like whenever Cecil first becomes a Paladin, twice before I realized my save battery wasn't working. It worked while it was in the system. I could even power off the system, power the system back on, and it would still save. But as soon as I took the cartridge out of the Super Nintendo, the save file was lost. So that was awesome, and it was a cool experience. It was really great playing through the first part of that game 3 times. But, you know, hey, I'm sure I've done it before in the past, so. I absolutely love the fight with Mylon on Mount Ordeals. After defeating him and his zombie minions, you cross the bridge, and what's this? A transformed Mylon comes back from the dead as a disfigured zombie himself and surprises your party. The back attack is a great touch too. It's just a real fun sequence. Of course, you can't talk about Final Fantasy II without talking about Cecil's transformation from a Dark Knight to a Paladin. This was so cool to me as a kid. I had never heard of a Paladin before this game. Cecil saving Rosa in the nick of time was really cool to me. I was kind of a sappy kid, so the whole romance between Cecil and Rosa was something I really enjoyed. I love the part where Golbez attacks and demolishes your entire party with his Shadow Dragon. Then Rydia appears just in time to save the day with her new powerful summoning magic. I didn't expect this at all the first time I'd played through this. Rydia, how did you survive? How did you grow up so quick? This was so cool. The ending is perfect. It isn't just a short little scene and a "the end" tagged on, it's a full epilogue packed with story about all of your characters. You aren't really left wondering what will happen to everyone. All in all, I love this game. I had a great time playing through it again on the SNES, and I highly recommend playing it if you've never played it before, or if you haven't played it in a long time. When it comes to which version you play, I would recommend playing whatever version you can get your hands on the easiest. The story's the same through everything. The DS version has some added story to it, which is kind of interesting. It deals with Kane and Cecil's relationship. I haven't actually played the PSP version, but I hear it's pretty good. The graphics look really neat on it, and I'd love to play it, but I don't have a PSP. I think you can also pick it up for your smartphone, so you can play through it on iOS or Android as well, and that is based on the DS version. I don't recommend picking up the original cart unless you're a collector or you really want to experience the original game again on the Super Nintendo and not on emulation. The cart costs around $30 to $40, and you may have to replace the battery, and that's going to cost you a little bit extra, especially if you don't have the equipment like I didn't. So I actually spent a little bit more on this cartridge than I wanted to, just because I had to replace the battery. So again, I do recommend playing this game, and I do recommend playing the version that's easiest for you to acquire. It's still a great game. I love it to death, and hope you enjoyed my review of Final Fantasy II. Later!